Erik the Great is a game about a young Viking warrior who is taking his very first quest in an effort to become one of the great men of his village. It's a hack and slash style game, but it's packed with a lot of mythology and history about the ancient Norse culture. We didn't want to create the stereotypical Viking game. What we wanted to do was introduce the player to some of the familiar and maybe not so familiar players in Norse culture, to try to teach them a little bit about what it was like in Viking times and the things that Vikings and Norse people valued. Everything from Loki's tricksiness to the belief that one's deeds made you great, even if you were atoning for something you had just screwed up, features very prominently in Norse culture, and we wanted to bring this out with our storytelling. We decided that we were going to use a dialogue system that was based off of the player questioning NPCs and finding out little tidbits about the bosses that they were going to encounter. Further along in the game, the player would be questioned by a troll, and that troll would ask them something that they should have learned if they had talked to all of the NPCs. If they answer correctly, they get a bonus. If they answer incorrectly, they get something taken away from them. The purpose of the game was to bring this storytelling out, kind of try to interactively teach the player a little bit about being a Viking.
The cinematic sequences in Erik the Great were added as an incentive to help establish and retain player interest by using various forms of interactivity to create an immersive experience. While some of the sequences in the game were created to give players a glimpse of the game's environmental features, others were created from storyboard excerpts by using in-game character interactions during critical gameplay stages. The game's cinematic scenes were not introduced until a week prior to our beta release, simply because we were focused on completing the game's core features. The time became an enemy, and only with a few weeks left to complete the game, we jumped ship from scripting to focus on visual interactivity our game desperately needed. Fast forward 2 weeks later, a total of 15 cinematic sequences were added to the game. We replicated one of those sequences multiple times to fire off at the end of each boss fight, so that saved us some time. All of the other sequences in the game on average used at least 10 cameras, a dozen particle systems, and several sound cues with voiceover acting. The biggest challenge for us came when we had to incorporate our dialogue windows with some of these scenes. By default, the dialogue windows were scripted to change text only when the player pressed a key or mouse click. Each of these messages in Kismet is natively assigned a specific camera. So, when the matinee sequence with multiple cameras is tossed into the mix, everything that could go wrong actually did. Coming up with a solution to this was a bit time-consuming, yet we were able to come up with a resolution. By simulating player inputs within Kismet to fire off command console nodes with active delays attached to each one, the dialogue system and matinee sequences were finally able to coexist. With very little time left to replicate the system across the board without putting the game's playability at risk, the addition of voiceovers was needed to fulfill the remaining matinee sequences. A familiar voice was used to act out the scenes. But how do we differentiate which actors were speaking during the game? Well, the vocals that were recorded and imported into UDK contain modulators to manipulate the voice pitches, which of course saved us time, so we could focus our energy and efforts elsewhere.
The thought process in the level design in Erik the Great was we wanted to stick with the topography of the region and the era in which the game was based. Since our game is very asset heavy, this became quite challenging because a lot of the assets that are in UDK just didn't fit the era in which we were building the game for. So we kind of had to do what we could to make things work, whether it's applying textures or going out to third-party sites to find anything that we could work, anything we could use that would work in some form or fashion and plug it in the game. That's why, unfortunately, there are a lot of places in the game where it's kind of sparse as far as what you can do. We didn't want to add assets just to add them. We wanted them to have meaning. And unfortunately, we didn't. There are spaces that we still wish we could fill, but there's just not time. Luckily, we were able to separate the maps, so we have the three separate villages. This allowed us to have multiple people working on maps at a time. Initially, we were going to have 1 to 1.5 people working on maps, but it became so overwhelming that at one point, we had 3 people working on maps, which was, far greater than we initially anticipated. It just shows you that the maps were pretty huge. And our first map, I kid you not, if you walked from the edge of a village, it was situated differently than any of the 3 we have now, but you could stand at the edge of the village and walk to the end of the map in the back, and it would take you 32 seconds walking in a straight line. So imagine that with the pathing and, all the interaction, and, people think the maps are empty now. You should have seen them then. The one thing that helped us a lot was the longhouse. We were actually able to, that was a prototype we did in research and marketing. There have been some changes, but for the most part, it is what it was in research and marketing, and that gave us a big jump when we got into the level design, because we didn't have to worry about that. And it's in 2 main parts of the game, when you transition talking to Father, and then when you come back before your battle to, win the gods over. So it was a crucial part of the game, and luckily we were able to get it done early.
When we first envisioned the world for Erik the Great, we knew that we would need to have 3 villages, and that we would need to come back to those 3 villages for a second pass. What we then had to decide was whether we wanted those 3 villages all to be in one giant map, or if we wanted to separate them into their own individual maps. We decided to go with individual maps for them, because that gave us the opportunity to work on the villages simultaneously and not have one person taking up the level design time for every village. The unique problems that we had with having 3 separate villages and trying to get them all to play within the game is if you hard load the village, it starts it from fresh, and when we came to the second pass, it would reset the village and we wouldn't get the second boss encounter or the second round of NPC dialogue. It would just continually bring us back to the start. We tried to stream the levels in and managed the second pass with booleans and triggers, and it got extremely complicated, and some of the music started to play over the top of other music, and the AIs would not respawn. So there were problems with both methods, and we tried many things out to try and get them to transition in a consistent manner. And it's still a toss-up whether we made the correct choice or not, the way that we actually played the game.
The heads-up display was an element of Erik the Great that was essential in the game to display health and stamina for Erik, as well as any enemy health the player needs to see. The HUD is located at the bottom of the screen, with large runes on each side of the character portrait. On the left side of the character portrait, we have Erik's health bar and stamina bar, which is easily visible for the player to see during the game. Underneath the bars, we have 3 slots where the stones are placed during the game as the player collects them. On the right side of the portrait, we have the enemy health bar displayed. Keeping the player and an enemy health bars in a central location for easy visibility during gameplay was an important feature. We as a team decided to keep the player focused on the action and not have the player's eyes wandering on the screen to check their health or enemy's health during combat. The center of the HUD is the live character portrait of Erik. This is a common live portrait you'll see in many MMOs on the market today. One of the things that went right with the HUD was our ability to figure out how to manipulate the images on the canvas. Once we had this figured out, many things started to fall into place quickly for the HUD. Placing the images for the runes, character portrait, and placing the health bars worked very well once the canvas was figured out. One thing that went wrong for us was implementing everything we wanted in the time frame we had and with our current knowledge level. We really wanted to implement a mini-map for the HUD, but the complexity was far greater than we thought it would be. Having researched further ahead into how difficult it would be to implement such a feature, Before, we listed this as something we could accomplish in time, would have saved us many hours we used on trying to create a mini-map. Some of the features that we added to the game were puzzles and obstacles for the player to encounter and solve during their travels through the game. We decided to add these features to give the player more to do other than combat in the game from point A to B. Some of the obstacles and puzzles are things the player must pass in order to continue, while others are for players who enjoy exploring the areas of the map. Some of the obstacles a player will encounter are falling boulders a player must avoid during their journey. There is a maze the player can enter to try to find their way out. There will be walls of fire the player must get past in order to progress through the map. One thing that went well for us was having brainstorming sessions to decide what kinds of things we could implement into the game. This helped get many ideas flowing with everyone on the team and sparked new ideas from someone hearing another member's idea for additions to the game. Brainstorming was a big benefit, not just for the feature session, but when it came to figuring out how to solve problems with bugs in the game we were fixing. One thing that went wrong for us was the amount of ideas we had for features, but keeping with the theme of the game. Many ideas sounded very good and were good, but did not fit the theme. So for us, keeping the balance of all the good ideas and what actually would fit into the game, and not seem too far-fetched for the era, it would have saved time for us to plan them out earlier in the project.
Assets were a big part of Erik the Great. We wanted to replicate the times of the Viking Age as closely as possible. There was a lot of research involved in this department. We had to look into the structures of longhouses, what villagers had in them to help with living conditions, decorations, land formations, and so on. This was actually one of the most difficult tasks for us because we had to search for free meshes that resembled something you would find in the Viking Age. Also, creating some of the meshes needed was difficult for the art department due to the detail that was involved. However, all was not lost as we were able to find and acquire from the art department Viking Age meshes that created the feel of Norse mythology. The team leader even paid for some of the assets needed to complete the game in this area. With our game being asset heavy, it made it easier for us to push the point that Erik the Great was a game based in the Viking Age with a Norse mythology undertone. However, some of our assets lacked in areas like animations. We really wanted to make the villagers feel alive through having them walking around and looking as if they were busy. We also lacked meshes for bosses and diversity for the villages. The dialogue mentions different attributes for each boss. The idea was to give players hint as to how to defeat each enemy. Each mesh and animation would reflect what was stated in the dialogue so the player could decide how to win in the boss battles. To make the villages diverse, we looked for different longhouse meshes. Despite not being able to find any, having team members create the villages added variety.
Now for the game, we wanted to keep it as realistic as possible. We didn't want to involve a ton of magic, a ton of spells, just hand-to-hand combat, hack and slash, as you would experience if you lived in the old days. Well, we put a little fantasy into the emphasis, and we have 5 different attacks for Erik. The first 3 attacks are basically your normal swing, your greater swing, and you have a knockback ability, or ground slam. The 4th ability is actually called Heroic Shout. Now, Erik doesn't actually attack during the Heroic Shout, but what it does, it allows him to regenerate some of his health with the sacrifice of stamina. That was also a thing we had to figure out too, was how to best balance stamina regeneration with attack execution to ensure that there was proper balance. Players could always, for the most part, do at least the basic melee attack if they were low on stamina, but easily able to execute, do greater attacks and so forth, provided they had enough energy to, fight on. The 5th and final attack added to Erik was more or less an FMV or full motion video animation, basically a cinematic attack. Erik doesn't obtain it till the very end of the game. It's a very powerful attack, does a ton of damage that Erik couldn't do with 100 or 1,000 or even 10,000 melee swings. So incorporating that, working on a final battle, It didn't seem fair if Erik had all the flash with the Big Bang, so we added some cinematic attacks as well for Loki, who's the AI that you meet up at the end of the game, also the story's arch nemesis. One challenge with that aspect is that we had to get a cinematic attack for Loki to play properly while Erik was able to do his at the same time. With very little knowledge as far as how to time that through scripting and so forth, we introduced it as a counterattack to correct the issue that we had beforehand, where if you had beat Loki, the game would end, but during the end cinematic sequence, you would have one more last replay of Loki's final attack. Well, Erik dies. You can imagine it instantaneously created bugs, so we had to correct it, work on the timings and so forth. It ended up working out, and that was probably the biggest challenge we had with the attack system.
One of the initial concepts we had for our dialogue system is we wanted it to be able to help guide the player through the game, but we also wanted it to be able to randomize the interaction. We didn't want the same thing to be presented over and over again. So with the dialogue system that we did end up incorporating into Erik the Great, it became very versatile. Not only was it used for dialogue, but it was used for our level transitions, our menu system. We even used it for credits. For the credits, we ended up putting in delays. For the dialogue, we ended up putting in switches, and that helped us achieve a random factor. At one point, I was looking at implementing an AI system which would actually work with the dialogue system so that it was completely automated and randomized. Before I found the switches, I was like, well, okay, I got to figure out something to make this random. The work was done. I mean, it was passing the information it needed to pass. I had one small piece that I had to get passed, and I couldn't do it in a timely manner. So I gave up on that idea, and I just tried the switches, and it worked out beautifully. So that's what we ended up implementing for Final Project. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't go back after graduation and try and figure out how to beat this and make it work the way I would like to see it work. If we had had more time, I would have loved to have been able to implement a custom UI to it. As it is now, I was able to get it so that we could incorporate textures. We could dress it up a little bit, but it didn't truly meet the artistic goals that we had for the game. It does upset me somewhat, but it's fully functional. The thing I do like is that the settings are all in one node within Kismet rather than having to set it throughout all the messages and through all the choice nodes. It's in one clean node, and that's it. That becomes easier to manage. What becomes difficult is when you have a conversation that can span, multiple choices or branch down multiple levels and so forth. That adds a lot of Kismet nodes, and it can get somewhat overwhelming if you're not careful. But overall, it's been a great system. Upon its inception, I had no idea that it was going to be so versatile and be used in so many different areas. And the best part about it was a time saver because the original system was one that we had implemented as a prototype in research and marketing. So we were able to get a jump again, just like with the maps, we were able to get a jump again in prototyping our first system. And there have been some tweaks along the way. I won't kid you. There have been some tweaks, and there's been some incorporation of other stuff to get it to work the way we intended. We were well on our way in research and marketing, so that helped us tremendously.
Overall, designing Erik the Great was amazing. We were able to solve most of the problems we faced through iteration and reiteration. It was challenging to come up with a lot of the solutions we have to make the game what it is. Tweaking and bug fixes helped us create answers to most, if not all, the problems that we faced. All in all, we were able to create an amazing game that allows players to see and learn about the Viking Age and Norse mythology. Thank you.